stories about how different our different communities work. And of course, in the San Antonio River Basin, we have much more development than in the Guadalupe. But and eventually, both the Guadalupe and the San Antonio River meet, of course. But so we developed a little presentation that we're hoping that will give you some insight to how this all got started, and hopefully inspire you to actually participate in the process. And here we go. They're participating in the state flood planning process. So this started with legislation back in around 2017, enabling legislation. Now, again, Harvey was in August of 2017, and that's what kind of encouraged the state legislature to take a more aggressive role in assisting communities for reducing flooding. So they created the legislation that is responsible or gives power to the Texas Water Development Board to develop a state flood plan. And in order to do this, they went ahead and divided the state into the regions based on the major water river basins. And then each region creates a committee that's, and all of these guidelines are set out in the legislation and enforced by the Texas Water Development Board to have different representation stakeholders. Annalisa and I are the environmental reps, and then we got small businesses, we got engineers, water purveyors, etc., that are all sitting on these committees trying to make decisions best for their own communities. And so here's a map of the, there it is. My computer is going faster than what you're seeing. So, so here's the state map with all the basins. As you can see, San Antonio is a really little portion compared to some of the other river basins. The Guadalupe River Basin is right there, and then you've got the the Colorado River, the Lower Colorado, etc. So what we've tried to do, Annalisa and I, and this process had went on, is to communicate with other environmental reps in other basins. And that's been a really rewarding process. We feel like we've been able to be heard a little bit better from that. But the great thing about the legislature is that they actually wrote in there about non-constructed or non-structured mitigation strategies. And this included natural mitigation strategies that would include everything from coastal regions to floodplains, headwaters, recharge features, etc.
Yeah, man, I was outside on the phone and I was like, that guy's bound to show up.
In the guidelines, it leaves room for us to be able to use green infrastructure, or what we're calling in this plan, nature-based solutions, which could be everything from land conservation to investing in green spaces, wetlands, constructed wetlands, and of course buyouts. Buyouts are in this area too. And it also includes restoration of streams and rivers and protecting headwaters. So one of the things that's been discussed a little bit more in San Antonio, I think, now than it has in the past, is the idea of hybrid solutions, especially in urban areas. And I guess River Road will probably be looking at some of that aspect as they try to recreate or put back into a stream system some natural functioning, some resilience to flooding, while providing recreation, wildlife habitat, both aquatic and terrestrial, etc. And some of these will be based on natural channel design, which the River Authority here in San Antonio has done a really good job of creating a whole manual talking about natural channel design. The other projects that could be included they're not just construction projects, are strategies. So I want you to know it was not easy to learn all these acronyms that we ended up having to talk about. So we have flood mitigation strategies that lead to protecting lives, property, and creating resilience. And this could be as little or as non-constructive as public education. Working with floodplain managers, they have to be certified and require continuing education. And there's also low water crossings are thrown into this as another strategy to protect, or should I say, low water crossing markers that tell you that there's flood conditions on the low water crossing. Evaluations were also a part of the submittals that could be used for funding through this process, developing additional hydrological information. And I think that was one of the things. I think the Guadalupe River is in pretty good shape, but we were amazed at how much data the San Antonio River Basin had that a lot of communities don't have access to, that they're using some pretty old maps and rough maps. And we're really lucky that the River Authority has put such a time and effort into creating the most up-to-date, precise hydrological information. And then you've got things that we're hoping that, because there's just not a lot of data. So, okay, you preserve some land for creating resiliency or whatever. What is, how do you quantify that? And that's what all the engineers and the politicians want to know. Okay, so we save this huge floodplain area. What do we get out of it? And how do we quantify the impact for reducing flood or flood risk? And then, of course, the really more difficult topic that in our committees are land use and development codes. How do we prevent future flooding that can be caused by land development? And it was, and for the San Antonio Basin, I'm not sure about the Guadalupe, every major community did have some kind of land use development codes, but are they strong enough to prevent flooding? That's the big question. So for the process, we created a plan for each region. And this was a 5-year cycle. We got started late in the process because of COVID, but we finished it this year, past year. And it's a 5-year cycle again. And we are just now starting the second 5-year cycle. So you have an ability to actually kind of push where you would like to see some of the strategies or projects that might be funded by the state. So we were able to, of course, make these plans. And the cool thing is that within the guidelines, every committee got to address their own community problems. We went out and we had stakeholder meetings. We gathered information about where there were additional floodings and what other people would like to have to see in their communities to reduce the flooding and the flood risk. So all of these plans, we had a deadline, submitted to the Texas Water Development Board this past summer. There was a time for amendments. The San Antonio plan was amended, but everything was done by this January. So the Texas Water Development Board is now in the process of, in fact, we just got the email for looking at making comments on the state plan, and you have an opportunity to also go out and make comments on the state plan. It's available right now for your review. And these comments is on a very short timeline because they're looking at trying to have this taken to the state legislature for approval in September. But the kind of a parallel track is also, and you've got all these stormwater engineers and all these folks that have had these major flood control projects sitting on the shelf, and they dusted them off and they submitted them for funding. And the good news is they're actually in the ranking. We're not exactly sure how this final ranking will happen, but there is a provision for giving extra points for nature-based solutions, even if it's just a portion of the project. But if that's being included, which is great, because we feel like that's going to help people to also think about water quality. As we know, this green infrastructure will be really important, especially for smaller events. Now, the part that's not so great is that most of the projects that were submitted were typical gray infrastructure projects, which doesn't mean that it's bad, but there's just not that much emphasis on nature-based solution. And why is that? Well, it looks like there's a whole bunch of folks out there that are in charge of flood control, managing floodplains, etc., that are not familiar with nature-based solutions. And how do you quantify that? How do you build these flood control projects, including some of the green infrastructure qualities? And then there's not really the understanding of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. They actually talk about, hey, you cannot have a project cause harm to another, to the floodplain or to another property or whatever, but it's pretty limited on the scope of what that means. It's pretty, I guess you would say, gross. You've got to have the water's coming onto somebody else's property and going in their front door. So that's kind of looking at how do we make this more available to some of the smaller communities that we work with in our basins? How do we develop an understanding of how to quantify the benefits? And how do we get ecosystem services rating at a higher level so that we don't have the major destruction to our natural streams, from everything from down cutting to water quality issues. But I guess the thing that really pops out when you do have down cutting and you disassociate your floodplain from your water, then you have additional issues, repercussions that actually impact everything from plants to animals to resiliency. So it seemed like this whole first 5-year cycle was really focused on how do we give relief to the numerous constituents. And of course, the state legislature really wants to be viewed as taking, we heard the issues during Harvey, what can we do? And so there's a lot of political motivation in this. So how do we get the biggest bang for the bucks? And when you're looking at flood control and traditional design, a lot of that means that you're digging a big hole in the ground to hold the water back to reduce peak flows. So this desire for immediate relief, and I love this little graphic because it really shows that, and especially even in San Antonio, we really didn't have a whole lot of drainage controls until the 90s. And so you have all these old parts of San Antonio that were built without any rules. And the thing that a lot of folks did back there is that they would go and buy property that was at flood risk and sell it at a much lower cost and build a home. And then with the increases, and that's one of the things that everybody in the state's dealing with, is that we have new floodplain maps. Not always, but typically that means that our floods are bigger, the intensity of the storms are more, and so that there's more properties that are being flooded. And this is a great little photographic of this situation. Hey, I didn't used to get flooded, but now I am. And guess who gets to pay for that? Yep, the taxpayers end up picking up for all the flood relief that's paid for to the property owners. The thing that, and I sit on the Stormwater Advisory Committee in San Antonio, and several of those members actually live in floodplains, and they're paying anywhere between $3,000 and $4,000 a year just for flood protection, which you have to have if you're going to see relief during a major event. So it's kind of mind-boggling when you think about this is just Bexar County, which does include the city limits and the ETJ, but we have about 11,000 structures that are in the current floodplain. And again, all of these property owners are supposed to have insurance. It also makes it very difficult for these property owners to sell the property or develop them. And that's a whole nother bag of worms. So looking at, again, most of what we're looking at are large channelization projects, stormwater detention facilities, and buyouts. But there's some pushback, and I don't know if anybody's got to see some of the media on the Conception Creek, is that there's a whole about 2,000 new homes that are in the new floodplain that's being released. So here we are with a traditional flood control This is in San Antonio on the west side. This is Ceiling Channel, which is a multi-million. This is about, I think they spent about $10 million on the Ceiling Channel, which empties directly into Woodlawn Lake. And what does that mean when we have this? Yes, we may be able to bring some of those properties out of the floodplain, but you definitely have an increase in environmental impact, right? So you've got the temperatures, air pollution, air quality, health risk. And then we had a lot of the community members that lived near the Ceiling Channel complaining about what this project has done to their community integrity. And of course, the aquatic terrestrial habitat, recreational opportunities, etc. And the big question is Ceiling Channel eventually will fail, and who will pay for the replacement? So that kind of brings us to the little, it's a very short video clip. And David gave a presentation to the San Antonio Regional Flood Planning Group. And his video was a real eye opener. And I hope that you will benefit by being able to.
Yeah, and before we started,
Yes.
I'd like to add for the Guadalupe, we have a great opportunity here in the Guadalupe watershed because a lot of it is not developed, but we need to plan and use our funding wisely because this watershed is being rapidly developed. A lot of the development is going on in the upper reaches of the watershed, which means that you're increasing impervious cover in these upper reaches. Some of them don't have the best flood management strategies enforced by local governments. And so you've got the makings of a huge problem in that these floodwaters will increase in volume and velocity downstream to communities that are much lower income. A lot of these communities, the majority of the folks who are impacted by these floodwaters cannot afford FEMA insurance. And we've even heard of cases where the community was denied emergency funds because those fundings are based on the number of people who hold FEMA insurance, and they didn't have them in their community. So there's a huge equity issue here. Yes. And we feel like at this point, if we can identify where nature-based solutions, including preserving land at the upper end of a watershed to not just mitigate flooding that's already happened, but preventing future flooding. So we do have a huge opportunity, but we need to work together to make sure that that opportunity is realized.
Well said. Well said.
Again, I'm Dave Skuodas. I'm a civil engineer by training, and I work as the director for design, construction, and maintenance at the Mile High Flood District. 24 to implement around $75 million worth of infrastructure and maintenance projects each year. So that keeps us pretty busy. For those that are unfamiliar, we are a special district that encompasses the greater metro Denver area. So we're not county or state. Our funding comes from a mill levy on property taxes. And we facilitate the rhyme and reason to how our urban waterways are managed as they cross 40 city and county boundaries along around 3,500 miles of major drainage ways. We work on floodplain mapping, master planning, flood warning systems, capital construction, and maintenance. We also work with our local governments on land development. This black areas on this map here are all the yet to be developed parcels. This is where we have the chance to avoid creating some of the problems from past land use and infrastructure decisions, which is the focus of this talk. We want to avoid situations like this, where neighborhoods were built where they shouldn't have. We get flood risk that looks like this, which then looks like this when it comes to fruition, like it did in 2013. I like to tell people my job is to keep floods outdoors, and this is why. Mitigating for this type of flood risk is quite the burden for taxpayers and the people living there. In our land use and infrastructure decisions, they're generally intended to make our communities better, but they can actually make our communities worse off if we're too short-sighted or too narrow in our thinking. And I've basically made a 20-year career out of building capital improvement projects to mitigate for land use decisions and to address failing or undersized infrastructure. Projects like this one along Wonderland Creek. It took 10 years and cost $30 million. Or this one along the Hoffman Drainage Way, it was 20 years, $8 million. Or this retrofit storm drain, 15 years, $10 million to stick a pipe in the ground and bury it. Now, mitigation projects are messy and expensive in every way you can imagine. And so developers, they may pay to install public infrastructure, but the local governments, we generally inherit it. And think about all of the pavement, the water lines, the sewer lines, the parks, you know, the list goes on. And the same thing goes for projects funded by the feds. They may help us build infrastructure, but they aren't really around to help us maintain it. Now, I'm not personally aware of any federal grants for infrastructure maintenance. And so our cities often develop in ways that are really inefficient from a long-term maintenance standpoint. So when all that shiny new infrastructure falls apart, there may not be enough local government funding to repair it or in some cases replace it. And so taxes generated from certain types of land use may not create enough revenue for the local community to someday pay for replacing the infrastructure supporting that land use. So perhaps a community does take in some additional taxes from new developments, and maybe there are even impact fees. But what if those funding inputs aren't enough to pay for the deferred maintenance or replacements, you know, the costs? It starts looking like credit card debt, which in many ways it is, because the cost of maintenance and replacement goes up over time, kind of like paying interest on your credit card. A specific example of this happened in Omaha, Nebraska, where the city inherited a number of developer-constructed roads, some of which were substandard. And the city eventually ran into a shortage of funds for their citywide pavement maintenance program. And in some locations, the city was actually forced to pulverize some of the failing roads, essentially converting them into dirt roads. And as you can imagine, that wasn't a popular outcome for residents like this fellow. I think he chose the wrong day to wear white sneakers, which is probably every day when you live on that particular road. And the more structural a piece of infrastructure is, the more expensive it will be to someday replace. In Denver, a glaring example is the Central 70 project. So several miles of I-70 were built as a viaduct back in the 1960s, and they must not have had the land to do anything simpler or less structural at the time because of the narrow corridor. So now we have this massive project to reconstruct this entire section of interstate, to widen it and lower it, and to place a lid over the top of sections of it. So it's evolved into this $1 billion with a B dollar project. It's very political, lots of riot picketing and very energetic public meetings. And while we could argue the merits of the design approach, what can't be argued is that the old viaduct was in disrepair and needed replacement. It only lasted around 50 years, and its condition was way past being an issue of maintenance. It's now another capital project on the same stretch of road 50 years later because of prior land use and infrastructure decisions that led to this outcome. So it's important to think long-term about land use and infrastructure decisions we're making today, because they tend to be pretty permanent. Our decisions outlast us and they get handed down to our professional successors. So long-term thinking, and I think this plays into some of the conversation you guys were just having, is why in Denver, we map floodplains using future land use conditions for our hydrology, because we know that developing land will increase runoff, and we don't want to remap floodplains every time a parcel develops. We're a cooperating technical partner with FEMA, and they allow us to do this as a regulatory tool, as long as the future developed flows are no more than 30% greater than existing hydrology. That's something we do here. So we map the floodplains with the future in mind. We also spend a fair amount of time trying to change mental models. This is a hard thing to do. So what are mental models? Mental models are the assumptions, generalizations, and other filters that underline how we interpret situations we come across. So our interpretation helps shape our response or action. So if I say the word dog, most of you will have an idea, a feeling, or a picture that enters your brain, and that's your mental model of a dog. Well, when I think of a dog, I think of my cute little fur baby, Rosie. There she is. So a positive mental model. Conversely, I have a friend who hates dogs. And that's because she grew up in a tough neighborhood with lots of guard dogs. She had to walk past to get to school. So this is her mental model of a dog, which is quite different than mine, of course, but founded on her experience. Well, in my work, I often interact with open space folks, and some open space professionals, when they hear the term flood control, this is their mental model. And maybe that's the mental model for some of you. It's no judgment here, okay? And I can't say I blame you. Engineers like me built these projects because they move a heck of a lot of water. But here is a side-by-side contrast of this same creek on the same day within a mile, showing how much different we build flood control today, at least in Denver. These are the same creek on the same day. I flew these with my drone. It was kind of fun. But the mental model of the imagery on the left explains why some communities don't allow new developments to count any of the floodplain towards their open space credit. So if drainage ways look like a box culvert without a lid on it, I get it. That doesn't really look like open space. But clearly, our modern design approach can be an asset to open space. Here, we're making infrastructure that looks like nature. And what's better for open space than a healthy flowing stream, especially in the middle of a city? So it's a problem when a developer can't count any of this wider floodplain. This is the same creek that I was showing you in that video. So it's a problem when the developer can't count any of the wider floodplain on the right towards their open space credit. It makes them resistant to a natural design approach because it takes more space. They end up losing lots. So here we have code based on an outdated mental model, at least in Denver. And this is why it's also important to think beyond your own expertise or department. And since I'm talking to folks out of state, I got to say, go Broncos. We had a good once when Peyton was there. It's been a while. So if we want better outcomes, then we need to embrace inclusion. So if we only know about one little niche of a complex city government or government agency, then it stands to reason we'll achieve better outcomes if we recruit people from other departments or disciplines. So let's say that this is a city government and you've got parks and public works and planning, and you've got police and social services, finance, legal. So in the example I just shared, if development code is being updated, then it needs to be an inclusive process, but inclusion, it works both ways. So for engineers like me, I don't typically dabble with writing land use code, but if an opportunity to participate comes up, then I need to pony up and help. And the higher the stakes of your project, the more impactful it will be, the more inclusion you need to plan on having. But inclusion can be really important in small things too. So as an example, there was a planning department for a local community that required developers to plant trees in landscape medians. And trees are great. I like trees, but here's what would happen. When they got too large, right-of-way maintenance crews would cut them all down because they interfered with maintenance. And this is one of those times where different groups within the city should probably talk. When it comes to medians, do we want beautification or maintenance? Could we maybe pick some smaller trees and have both? Sometimes we can have both. And I was part of the design team for the Wonderland Creek I mentioned earlier. And one thing I'm happy we did as a design team was we asked maintenance staff who plows snow along the trails for input on the design. We have to plow the trails here in Colorado because of the snow. And some of them get treated as nicely as the roads do, depending on the trail. So this was a brand new stretch of regional trail. And so we asked, how could we adjust the trail, the railings, the walls to make plowing easier? It's got these equipment, like how big is your equipment? Is it on a truck? Is it on an ATV? How big is your blade? These sorts of questions. The changes ended up being a few feet here and there and didn't really cost much extra, but it created more long-term value because we thought to ask. And so asking for input for maintenance staff is easy to do, but it's also easy not to do, right? And so it takes intention and forethought. Okay, we also should consider the full life cycle cost of our infrastructure. One of the services we provide at the Mile High Flood District is long-term maintenance of our urban waterways. And we've been around for over 50 years, and we've learned a lot about life cycle costs because we get to deal with our own prior infrastructure decisions and the consequences of whether those were good ones or not. And so I did a financial analysis recently of some sites around the metro area, and this gets back to the issue I brought up earlier. I wanted to know, will the revenue generated from the adjacent land use pay to maintain the infrastructure serving it? And so let's look at a few examples that attempt to answer this question. These are really short and sweet. So here we're looking at a stream called Lena Gulch, and to allow for more property to be developed, the stream was shoved into this rectangular concrete channel section. So yeah, that's technically a creek. The channel was built this way to allow for a few extra commercial buildings that you see here. I looked into how much this property is worth, and with a little math, was able to figure out that we get around $400 in revenue from this property each year. I looked at what it would cost to fully replace all of the concrete someday, and I'd ask you guys to take some guesses, but you'll never guess. It would take 17,000 years for us to build up enough funding from the revenue from this property to pay to replace the channel infrastructure that was put there in this way, really to benefit how that land developed. And I'm not making that up, I did the math myself. Let's look at a couple other locations, because it's not always quite that bad. Here we're at the Maxwell tributary. It's a concrete lined channel that sits in the street median, and it's quite undersized, so the road is used for conveyance here. The real estate in the watershed adjacent to the channel is worth over $200 million, which allows us to collect around $10,000 a year. So if we just replace the channel lining and exclude all the culverts like you see here, it would still take us over 600 years to build up enough funding from this neighborhood to pay for the replacement. In the meantime, we patch it when it breaks and hope it holds together. At this final location along Newland Gulch, we are in a more open channel, but it's still fairly trapezoidal and with some really large grade control structures. I mean, look at how big that thing is, all that rock, compared to the houses on the right or that playing field on the left. Now, the property in this watershed adjacent to the creek is worth over $760 million, allowing us to collect around $38,000 a year. And it would still take us over 300 years to build up the funding to replace the 25 grade control structures in this part of the stream. I hope they last 300 years, but I wouldn't bet on it. So what we find is that much of our ability to create longer lasting, more resilient, lower maintenance stream infrastructure rests on the amount of land we have to work with. In this aerial comparison, it shows how stark this contrast can be. These images were taken from the exact same altitude for streams that convey a similar amount of water. So when land use decisions force us to confine our streams, you know, the water flows faster and deeper, putting more stress on the bed and banks, and this explains the history of building concrete-lined channels around the country. The concrete is necessary to withstand the depth and velocity of flow caused by the confinement. And you know, you think of how the water speeds up on your garden hose when you stick your thumb over the end, and the same principle applies here. You shrink the area, the water moves faster. Now, this sort of design is actually pretty low maintenance until one day, when it's not, just like with the Central 70 project, when infrastructure like this someday falls apart, it's really expensive and can be awkward to maintain or replace. I found this photo on the internet somewhere and I saved it for just this occasion. I don't know how they're going to get to the rest of it. I figure they got to wait for that part underneath them to cure, and then they'll get to those gaps in between. I don't know. There's a story there and I need to know it. I don't know it. Okay, so then when we open the banks up a bit, whoops, we need less rock and concrete, but in this photo we're still looking quite structural, and structures like this are prone to failure. This is an example where a big sinkhole formed under a structure like that. On this next one, we're doing a little better. You start to see less structure, more green, and then on this last photo, along Westerly Creek, this is more of the ideal situation where we've given the stream plenty of room and we don't need to import nearly as much rock and concrete. And interestingly, this is an engineered channel that used to sit under the runways of the old Stapleton Airport. You know, sometimes we don't have the room to do this, but this is the ideal. With space for flood flows to spread out, resilience is achieved with healthy vegetation instead of a bunch of rock or concrete, and it looks like open space. Bonus. So but how does it hold up to floods? Does this hold up? Do we have to go out and maintain this every time we get a big flood? Well, here's a photo of the same creek a little further downstream, and keep an eye on that bridge. Here is the exact same view at the height of the 2013 flood. So this was definitely a 100-year plus flood on this creek. This next photo is of the very next day, and then back to the first photo, which was actually taken 8 months after the flood. So there was nothing to fix here, just some debris to clean up. You know, no search and rescue helicopters or anything like that even. It was a spectator event. A person took the photo of that flood from a bridge on a nearby road. So long-term maintenance here involves weed whackers and trash bags rather than heavy earth-moving equipment, because there really isn't anything to fix. So we get to play the role of urban gardeners. And green infrastructure like this gets stronger over time as the vegetation matures, whereas gray infrastructure is strongest the day it's installed and gets weaker every day after. In the future, we want to influence land use patterns further out into the watershed. We don't want to just deal with the increase in runoff all in the receiving stream. We think we could avoid these expensive stream restoration projects altogether if the land were developed in a way that avoids increasing runoff. These old school approaches cut off all these smaller first order tributaries, turning them into gray curb gutter and storm drains. And so if you were to shift, you know, sometimes traditional site planning is just because it's easier and everybody's used to it. You can get an approval, you can deal with your MS4 or whatever sort of permits. But if you were to shift from a traditional site plan like this to that kind of starts with the road network and plans around the road network first and foremost, switching that to the one on the right, which is a dendritic or tree-like one where you honor the natural topography a little better, we could reduce or almost eliminate the increase in runoff caused by development. We actually did the math, and the site layout on the right actually yields a similar number of lots to the layout on the left. And we did the math. It reduces runoff, and the stream could potentially be left in its natural state and not just erode like crazy because of urbanization. But here's the thing, at the flood district, we can like this idea all we want, but we need to seek feedback from our initial pilot projects and be ready to course correct. We need to have a sense of inclusion because changing traditional site planning needs to work for developers, planners, and even the market for potential home buyers. You know, will they like it? And we need to ponder what this layout means for long-term upkeep and maintenance. Will it age well? So just a couple other quick hitters before I close. I'm almost done here. One helpful tool we use in Denver is that we define a major drainage way as having a tributary of 130 acres or more. Well, why is that? Well, it's because someone did the math and figured out this is the threshold where typical pipe and gutter flow criteria gets exceeded in the major storm. And so at greater than 130 acres, we require open channel because it's better and safer and more functional infrastructure. We also map something we call a stream management corridor, because a stream isn't a line, it's a corridor. I heard that quote somewhere and it stuck with me. And so this is a management tool for working with new development primarily, but we pretty much mapped every drainage way in the district. The simplest version it gets interesting with them sometimes, I'll just say that. We've also coined a new term called high functioning and low maintenance streams, or HEFLMs. If we could think of a better acronym, we would, but that's what we got. This is a philosophy that informs our approach to urban stream design. And so with hydrology, we look for runoff reduction wherever we can get it, even at the site scale. We designed for the hydraulics needed to keep people safe. We considered the geomorphology to see what a sustainable naturalized channel could look like. And we incorporate site-specific vegetation and community values to provide function for the 99% of the time when there is no flood. We even have a local engineer writing a doctoral dissertation about this approach, so we'll see where he gets with that. But ideally, it looks like the photo on the right there, like God created that stream instead of it actually being an engineered channel within a corridor be preserved as land developed around it. You know, achieving this sort of outcome takes a fair amount of inclusion and planning for it early as the site is being laid out. We want this corridor preservation predictable for developers because they're not fond of surprises, as it were. We apply this philosophy on mitigation projects too. You know, the idea is to get as much function as we can get out of a site given the context and site constraints we're working with. And so it's hard to argue this isn't an improvement upon this, you know. On this next one, we got really creative and used a naturalized channel for frequent storms on top, and then a buried box culvert for flood conveyance underneath that gets rarely used. It's kind of like, we like to call it a drainage mullet. It's function on top and conveyance on bottom. And lastly, I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the Mile High Flood District's approach to land use and infrastructure. And with a shameless bit of self-promotion, I'll tell you, I wrote a book about why it matters to be a good client in the construction industry, and it's full of anecdotes about working in water. So if you're ever looking for a keynote to bring in for a conference, let's talk. So thank you for having me. I'll be around for questions if you have time.
We'll take your questions here, and let's see. Nathan, do you have the, do you want to read out questions to us and we'll answer them?
Yes, I can do that. So, one question I had was talking about flood tax or insurance. The question reads, flood tax or insurance is only for land that has a building on it, correct? Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so the question I have is flood tax or insurance is only for land that has a building on it, correct?
Yes.
Oh, well, they can't hear you, so hold on.
Yes, that actually is correct.
Okay, thank you. And that was the only question that came in. Any other apologies for technical difficulties. Got a lot of technology, we just got to roll with it. But any other questions or comments, feel free to raise your hand or reaction. Anything else you want to add, Annalisa or Debbie?
No, I hope you enjoyed that. I think, I hope that y'all find that useful, and that you will also take the opportunity that the state is providing right now for regional flood, for comments on the regional flood plan. And moving forward, we will at GEAA keep you alerted to opportunities to advocate for these plans. But basically, we will also need all of y'all in your local communities to advocate for these, because what we're seeing is kind of a mishmash of different planning for flooding or lack of planning for flooding as new development goes in.
Yes, and then making sure that we're not a dog chasing its tail, that we actually include in the funding from the state for doing the conservation and encouraging communities to look at their development codes in order to get ahead of the increase in flooding that we're experiencing.
Yeah, and we also have a huge opportunity because here in Central Texas, we've got the karst aquifers, the Edwards and the Trinity, and part of the the process for regional flood planning was also ranking higher if it was able to use the stormwater to increase water supplies for a community. So we have with our karst aquifers, we have huge opportunities to take advantage of recharging our groundwater and storing that water underground where it won't evaporate. And we also have opportunities for aquifer storage and recovery. Okay, Gemma, I see you have your hand up. You're on mute.
So I'm interested I like the stream management of corridors. And since I'm in a floodplain, so we're having all this work done on our certain area of the San Antonio River, but yet I don't see planning up ahead. So since the floodplain has changed dramatically in such a shorter time period in this neighborhood, when they do stream management now, like the Corps, will they be looking at a plan on how much flooding may change? Or is it only this one shot in time when they're looking at it? Because we're getting, as you know, the floodplain has changed markedly from 5 houses to 35 houses. And then now it's in people's living rooms when they do the designation. So when they fix this, they have this mental image right now about this corridor, or are they also looking at the long range from what's going to be coming, the flow down?
That's a really good question, Gemma. It's a little bit of both. So we, in this plan that was adopted, every region had to look at the new Atlas 14 data. Right. And that's what in San Antonio or in the San Antonio River Basin, we're updating all the floodplain maps to reflect that. Well, NOAA, who created that map, is already working on the Atlas 15. So yes, that data will be changing. And this data is created by long-term measuring across the country frequencies and intensities of storms. So this is a federal agency that's actually setting this information. Also, for communities or for the regions, we had our current floodplain, but we had to project in the future. Since we don't have the Atlas 15, where are we going to go to? And that was very difficult. It was a little point of contention in what our basin agreed to use. And we asked the state to actually, hey, can you just like have everybody doing apples and apples here? We use the 500 year. And I don't know if you're aware, but Houston is actually, their development codes require you to build to the 500 year storm.
Okay.
And we could do that too.
Yeah, and Gemma, I will say too, I've noticed San Antonio River Authority had put in like one LID project to take in stormwater along Broadway. And I guess they could actually do a lot more to keep those waters from going down into your area.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering, since they're going to do this major construction, when we go to this meeting tomorrow night, it'd be a question to ask, how are they looking at what's coming down? Because I know where it floods now, but that's increased. And it's a different flooding pattern than before. So if they're putting millions of dollars into the reconstruction of this and all the planting that Sarah promised they're going to do maintenance for the next 10 years on, how does this fit in with the flood plans? So thank you.
Okay, I have 4 questions on the chat that I want to get to as well before we conclude. The first question I have is from Lisa Martinez. How can we expand the knowledge of natural resource solutions to the local discussions?
I think it's Lisa. I think it's the same way that we've always done it. You have to show up where those plans are being made and just advocate and advocate. And I mean, we've been doing this for so many years. And the reason, like I said, that the TWDB did include natural infrastructure and options for funding is because we were there. It wasn't just GEAA, but it was a whole bunch of organizations
Across
that we
the
work
state.
with in there advocating for that. So it's just the best way to do it is to every opportunity that you have to weigh in to do it. And then we will be in there pitching for you as well. I mean, it's great because the reason Debbie and I are able to serve on these flood planning groups is because it's our job. So we will try to be in there advocating for you as well.
And that's why we want to hear from you. And if you need any assistance in understanding more of how you can be a part of this, that would be great. And I think that on that slide beforehand, on these sites, they actually have when the meetings are going to happen. These meetings are open to the public, but you can also just send your overall goals or policies that you would like to see implemented. And I think there's been a lot of folks that have looked at trying to better quantify ecosystem services, and it hasn't really been that successful to date because of the incredible value of development. But and my favorite one, that story that Annalisa talks about, if we lost the quality of the water in the Edwards Aquifer, what would it cost us to actually clean it up before we drink it? And that those are the kinds of conversations that we need to have.
Okay, thank you. The next two questions are kind of hand in hand. It's talking about comments to the draft plan itself. One of them's asking for links for comments and to the plan itself, and if the draft plan is as insightful and forward-facing as the presentation we just saw. They also state they were unaware of the draft plan, so thank you.
Yeah, Rachel, can you find a link to the draft plan and put it in the chat?
Yes, we'll get that link.
Yeah, we'll get that link up
We
in the
actually
chat.
just received that this week. I
Yeah,
think
this week.
just this week. So we'll forward that on to you. And there's a lot of forward thinking in the plans that I've looked at. I haven't looked at every river basin, but the implementation will take a much longer time. But it also depends on people asking for it. We don't want the traditional infrastructure if we can avoid it. And how do you soften it? And that's one of the reasons why I like Skuodas's video, is that he really shows you some options. Get out of the concrete channel box and think more broadly.
Yeah, and then we had also asked, as part of the projects that will be funded, that they have the opportunity to work with TWDB staff. The Texas Water Development Board has hired a contractor to advise on implementing green infrastructure. So
And
we
godlight.
asked before the funding is approved for these projects that the TWDB would provide somebody as a resource to advise on how they can incorporate green infrastructure into the projects. And as a good example, City of San Antonio, I think with our regional flood management, they required the city and all the new flood control projects to include green infrastructure if they were going to do funding. And we've gotten briefings, and some of the funded projects, we were like, well, what green infrastructure are you going to put in there? And they're like, well, we don't know. We'll have to figure that out. But they do know that they're required to do it. But we're really asking the state to provide the resources to help these folks. And Ben has your hand up.
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking, I was just looking at the plan and then the draft plan, at least for Region 11, and then I was looking at the survey, or at least where you can give feedback to the state. And of course, they're like trying to get us to go through section by section, and most people are just not going to go that in depth. And so then that gets me thinking, okay, well, either we need guidance for what to say in each section, but then I was also thinking about how, look, we just saw a great presentation where the guy was saying that gray infrastructure is expensive, not only to put in, but to maintain, and that it becomes a cost liability to taxpayer. taxpayers. And so that got me thinking, I wonder if there's some simple messaging that you all might recommend that basically would deliberately appeal to that sensibility that government always has to try to pinch pennies and basically say things along the lines of, look, green infrastructure is more affordable, it's safer, it's better for taxpayers over the long run. Please support that. Or something along those lines. I wonder what kind of comments, I guess, would be helpful to add that wouldn't require people to go through paragraph by paragraph and offer commentary. You guys have any thoughts?
That's a good point, Ben. And the data is out there about crime reduction, neighborhood or housing property values increasing with green infrastructure. So it's really kind of a win-win. And it's just we're looking at turning a great big boat and then having them think outside the box. So it takes everybody in the audience to actually push forward. And I guess there may be some opportunity in the state legislature.
Yeah, and I mean, last session in the state legislature, we did submit comments on these topics. They were very well received, actually, by the legislators and by the Texas Water Development Board. It's happy to have an advocate. So we're trying to keep you posted on these things, but I think something as simple as the comment that you just stated, Ben, is great, because they don't hear from many people. They hear from us where we go through item by item, and I hope we have time to do that and still have summer vacations. But yeah, so I think any comments that you have, and I think we'll try to keep you updated. If you have anything specifically that you think you need help with, please do contact me. Our contact information is up on the screen here. And we'll be happy to help out as well. But don't feel like you have to be totally
read the whole document.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you know where you want to go and what policies you want to promote. So just supporting that concept and pushing it forward.
So I see Pam has a hand up.
Hold on. Before we take more questions, we are over time. So it is a little after 4:30, and we have a question on the chat, and we have a hand raise. So I do want to be respectful of people's time, and if you are needing to jump off, please go ahead and do so. I do want to turn it over quickly to Rachel Haynes, our policy director, to mention our next topic for the lecture series number 6 coming in June. And I will open the floor to her, and then those who are still online who want to answer these questions, Pam will get to your comment, your raising hand, and Lisa, I know you have another question as well. But I do want to give Rachel some time to promote our next lecture series coming in June.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. So our next lecture series is in June. Like Nathan said, it'll be, of course, as always, the 4th Wednesday of the month. So it'll be June 26th. And the title of the presentation is Transportation Growth and Planning in the Greater San Antonio Region. The speaker will be Isaac Gonzalez. He is a short-range transportation planner at the Alamo Area Metropolitan Planning Organization. So it should be a really fun presentation, a little bit different than what we normally do, but something that is very important to our work as well. I will put in the chat the link to that presentation, and then I will just note that the registration will open tomorrow morning. So wait until tomorrow morning if you're going to register. I did put the links in the chat for Pam for the comments in the plan. So I'll turn it back over to Nathan to address with those who are still on the call, Julie's and then Pam's question.
Yeah, so Pam, you have your hand up. Do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I just wanted to make sure I understood how the state flood plan by the water board applies across various jurisdictions. So like you have the city, you have the county, you have the extra jurisdictional areas that get developed. I mean, how does this all work together? Is everyone under the requirements? Because what happens is San Antonio adopts things that have already been developed and they haven't been developed by our codes and our requirements. And then we have this big mess we have to clean up or try to work with. And so I'm wondering if these standards are going to go across, whether you're in a city, whether you're in a rural area, what have you.
Yeah, Pam, you brought up a really good topic because it's been frustrating to us. To my knowledge, I think almost every one of the regional flood planning groups recommended that funding for projects should be contingent upon these local governments adopting good stormwater management plans. And that was knocked out. We know from the interim charges that were put in for the state legislature and for plans to file bills during the 2025 session, that we're going to see a huge challenge to even enforcing the regulations that we have, and that includes stormwater regulations. So we're going to have to all pitch in and work really hard together. Developers have already said that under the guise of providing affordable housing, they want to roll back regulations. There are plans perhaps to even limit extraterritorial jurisdictions in the legislature. So things have the, we have the prospect of things getting much, much, much worse. But we've also been pretty good at working against bad bills. But y'all are probably going to be getting a lot of legislative alerts from GEAA during this next session, and we will need everybody to pitch in and contact your legislators and the committee members. And do you have another question? Is it?
I do. I have one more. Lisa Martina asks, are there state agencies teaching about natural resource solutions? And she mentioned how years ago she took a Texas A&M AgriLife community education class called Watershed Stewards. Is the flood work connecting to the watershed work? It's the flood work connecting to the watershed work across the state.
The Texas Water Development Board released a contract and has an advisory board to actually do guidelines. Louisiana already has a guidelines for nature-based solutions and how they should be implemented across the state. And Texas is looking forward to having that. I think that will assist. And of course, once you write a book, then you have to go out and do the public training and making sure that there's incentives involved too. And I think Annalisa's comment about, hey, if you're not regulating development and exacerbating the flooding, then you're not going to be available for the monies for flood control.
Yeah, and then also, Lisa, I get the notices from the EPA, and the EPA is constantly having good free programs on that.
And they're all available online.
Yeah, they're available online and they're all free. So I think it's the EPA is doing much more than the state of Texas in that area.
That's for sure.
Well,
any others?
Okay. No, I think that's all the questions that are popping up on the chat. As a reminder, Rachel posted the draft 2024 state water plan along with the comments link for you who are interested in reading over the plan and submitting your comments as well. Rachel also went ahead and posted the link to get to the registration page for our WaterWonks Lecture 6 series, and registration will be open for that tomorrow morning. And let's see, thank you. Please send, Lisa, could you send the EPA information so I can distribute it to the master naturalists and others?
Sure, we can do that.
Sounds good. And we'll give that to you, Lisa. Okay. So with that, I will formally stop the recording and